Okay, there we go. Okay. All right, so here we are. So intelligence is doing the right thing at the right time, as defined back when people were trying to figure out which animals were more intelligent than each other, right? And I love this definition, not only because it was the first one I learned as an undergraduate in Chicago, but also because it's a form of computation. And you'll see me use that later in the talk. But oops, now I have to accept that or else I can't go forward. Okay, here we go. Get back to the slides. There we go. Okay. And as we mentioned yesterday, I prefer the definition. There are many definitions, but I like to use the definition of agents where there any vector of change. For example, chemical agents are the ones that cause a reaction. But the things that people really care about are not so much intelligence and agents. I think the main things that we will care about that's like important to us is who is responsible for their actions, and also who are those people responsible for, okay? And notice I've highlighted here that these are done by a society. So different societies have different ideas about how old you have to be to consent to sex or to fight in the military, or all kinds of different, who can own what gender you have to be. Sometimes people think that you're not an adult until your father dies, right? So these are things that have traditionally not only been defined by a society, but I would argue define a society. So this is a slightly different take on ethics, although maybe Lynette will now tell me this was also Locke, I don't know. But I would argue that ethics is determined by and determines a society. It's all of the rules that you use for holding your society together. And notice this is, I put here what Lynette just told us is the second definition of fairness, a constantly renegotiated set of equilibrium. We keep striving for more inclusion and basically more security, more strength for our society. All right. By this definition, law is a part of ethics. All right. So artificial intelligence, once you've got all this, then it's really easy. Artificial intelligence is just the subset of the intelligence stuff that somebody built deliberately. And normally in most of human societies, we consider the deliberate action by an adult is the responsibility of that human adult. Okay. And so that's where my line on AI ethics being human-centered comes from. All right, so, but that's not what we're talking about. We're here to talk about transparency. And before I talk about transparency, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this responsibility notion I've been leaning so hard on. Okay, so responsibility is a property of moral agents it is the property that moral agents of society assign to each other in order to uphold that society, okay? And so it implies a peer relationship, as does trust. We were just talking about this too. So trust is a relationship between peers where we allow a trustee not to be micromanaged, right? And when we say allow here, we can see this also in non-human primates, right? Like what is it, why people are always saying, why do the subordinates allow the dominants to prevent them from having access to the females or whatever? This is with males, obviously. And well, maybe not entirely, obviously. Anyway, and then people turned it on their head and they thought, oh, maybe what's really going on is that the dominants are failing to invest that much effort to fully chase away the subordinates, because they do get some access to good things, including security, by hanging around with the truth. So when you get into a situation where you need ethics is when you can't actually entirely control the society. It's actually, that's what the pureness is about. It's about that this is the best way to be able to be secure yourself. It's not just about what is right or whatever. And certainly the monkeys aren't sitting around discussing ancient texts. They're just saying that, though they're not saying, they've evolved to be in these contexts where they put enough effort in to try to maintain the status that they can achieve, but also they don't want to waste too much time chasing the others away. And that turns out to be good for their security. Anyway, what this implies is that we should not trust powerful agencies, but rather construct systems to hold them accountable, which of course it turns out is Locke. I didn't know that. Okay, accountability is a society's capacity to trace that responsibility. And now we get to transparency. It's the means by which accountability is implemented. I say never an end to itself, but a lot of computer scientists, we just think, oh, I'll be transparent. All right, but the idea is, how do you know how much transparency is enough? So a lot of computer scientists used to think it was transparent if you open sourced your software. So, and it took us a while to figure out that wasn't either necessary nor sufficient. right? So the medical industry is much better regulated, pharmaceuticals much better regulated, not perfectly, but better than the software industry, right? And it has 10 times as much IP. It's not that it open sources everything to everyone, it has trusted people that come in and audit it. And similarly, if you do dump 10 million lines of code on the internet, nobody understands that. It depends how you wrote it. So transparency takes more effort than that. You actually have to make sure that you can demonstrate that you have been behaving accountably. And to be motivated to do that, you have to have somebody that's applying enforcement. And so this is where the question of self and other governance comes in. Okay, so transparency is the information pathways through which understanding, including accountability, can be established. Okay, this is my claim, this is a new slide, and responsibility enforced. And then just as a line, this has been a remarkably clean meeting, so I probably don't need to talk too much about this, but you cannot enforce directly against the system, the technology. And so, well, I forgot I put this in here. This is a slightly older paper where I was talking about whether or not AI should be treated as a moral patient, dealing with the anthropomorphism issues. But if you think of a behavioral context where there's more than one thing you can possibly do. So an individual has multiple choices, and one is considered by a society to be the more socially beneficial, all right? So I think that is the time when you start talking about moral actions. And so a lot of people have said, but of course, AI is a moral agent because it takes moral actions, right? And that's true by this definition. So if you say, easily you could have a robot that could recognize there's more than one context, and one is the one that benefits society. So we could build that, all right? But my argument here is that even though there is these are moral actions, they have impact on the society, that doesn't imply that the agent that takes them is necessarily a moral agent within the context of society. So I already mentioned monkeys behave also as if there's individuals who are responsible for their actions. They punish those, even superordinates. They can mob against superordinates if they think that the superordinate is being unfair, like it's beating up a subordinate too much. But also within your own household, you might treat a pet as if it's a moral agent. You might say you knew better than to poo in the middle of the floor or something. And the pet may be treating you like a moral agent, say you knew better than to come home that late, right? And you're sanctioning each other, right? So you're treating each other as moral agents within the context of your household. But within the context of society, nobody's going to accept that your dog is responsible for what your dog does. Not entirely, right? You are responsible, you are the moral and legal agent of a Western society. Okay, so this comes back to the socially sanctioned thing. So we cannot sanction against AI, right? Law and justice are more about dissuasion than recompense. Recompense is nice when you can get it, but we really want to make sure that bad things don't keep happening. And so the phenomenological impact of social sanctions on AI is just in no way equivalent to its impact on humans, right? I was going to say Drosophila, I'll try to stop being such a biologist. Even fruit flies, if they've been separated for a while, then when they get back together, they start fighting over status, right? Their fruit flies are more violent, right? We have that understanding of, when we come back and we've been away for a long time, of that conflict. We have more phenomenological in common with fruit flies than we will ever have with designed artifacts. And people have trouble getting that through their heads because of the automatic anthropomorphism that was being discussed yesterday. For example, the fact that they're using natural language. But it just isn't the same. No system is going to care about the fact that it's been turned off or put in the closet or anything else. You can put a number in the system so that when that number goes high, it says, oh, I don't like this, right? But it's not the kind of systemic aversion that any social animal feels to isolation because of evolution is trying to stop us from doing something stupid, which is getting eaten by big bears or something, right? That's systemic. When you build AI, you don't do that. Safe AI is modular, and we'll talk about this later. Some people talk about end-to-end, they also talk about whole brain uploading. I don't think that that's a very good way to engineer systems. There's limits to how much you can do that way. But also, if we're talking about a regulatable system, then we need modularity. And I'm going to give an example. That is the one slide I did insert into this last night that was totally new because in response to Son of Octor. But I just want to point out that AI, if we made it a legal agent, it would be the ultimate shell company. That we have a paper about this. And in the paper, going back to this conversation about, is this just AI or is this governance in general? In the paper, we point out that this process of trying to recognize AI as a legal person is part of the process we've seen since the end of the Cold War of allowing the use of legal personality, right? So it's sort of part of the corruption of the system since the 90s. All right, so digital systems are easy to make transparent. Now, I loved the EU white paper by and large, but there was at least two things that were really incomprehensible to me why they believed. One was that risk-based enforcement was somehow had to do with binary, like binary status. And the other was that AI is necessarily opaque. They kept saying that, like, no, it's not. And then I was on some panel with a guy that was the head of Google for Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. And he's like, oh, we love the EU white paper, especially these two parts. And I was like, oh, now I know where those two parts came from. Anyway, when we audit, we don't audit micro details, right? Like if you're auditing a bank, you don't say, explain to me what the synapses are doing in the bankers, okay? We audit what the humans, because they're the peers, they're the ones we can enforce against, what the humans did when they built and they trained and they tested and deployed the system, right? So good maintainable systems engineering of software, which AI is almost always software, there's some hardware components, but we're talking about software right now. When you architect the system, there's going to be a design, you need to document that, what are the components? You get these crazy people from, what is it, Future of Life, you know, so talking about like, what if your chess program shoots you because you turn it off overnight when it wanted to learn? It's like, okay, first of all, no programmer ever turns off their computer at night. What are they talking about? We want the systems to learn at night. But secondly, no programmer puts a gun on a chess program. What are you talking about there, right? So there is an architecture to a system. You keep track of what the components are and where they came from, where the software was. How do you, Sita Girza has done this great paper with her partner, whose name I've just forgotten, about the agile turn in software and how that has been a way of breaking responsibility. And we just saw that by Microsoft and everybody who uses their systems, including a lot of governments, with the solar flare thing. Solar winds, but anyway, you need to know, because that, I don't know if you know, that was like 2 companies back in the chain of libraries. It wasn't really SolarWind that had the direct hack, but they were using software that somebody else had produced, and that was where the injection happened. Okay, so the provenance of the software and the data libraries. Again, you can do certain kinds of attacks. I don't know if they're overrated by assault through data libraries, but more importantly, going back to sort of the bias things, you need to know, did you source appropriate data? Where did it come from? Could anyone have injected things? All right, we keep track of this stuff. You know, if you were making any other manufactured product, of course you would be keeping track of who were the people that you sourced your components from. Can you trust them? You know, all those kinds of things. Are they using ethical practices? It's normal. It's just that people haven't been seeing software as a manufactured artifact, but it is. And incidentally, for those of you who can legislate, it would be nice, this is ambiguous in the EU law right now. We need to make it clear that even if software provides a service, it is a product that provides a service. Okay, so please do clarify this. Right now it's ambiguous. But I'm going to assert it is a manufactured product and we should just be using normal liability to that. Okay, so then also you secure all the stuff that you do yourself. So you're actually building of things. And this is normal. This has been normal for about 30 years. You know, we've been improving, it's called DevOps. We've been improving DevOps in software since the 80s and 90s. In fact, actually through the 70s, you can read Frederick Brooks' book from the 70s about how to do better DevOps, although it wasn't called that then. But for some reason, AI companies are not doing this, or if they are doing it, they're hiding it from the auditors, right? They're pretending not to do it. Anyway, of course you should do this. Maybe it's because AI companies have a lot of psychologists in them, or maybe they believe their own hype and they're anthropomorphizing and they say, oh, you don't keep logs on children. So anyway, for machine learning, you also need to log, as I mentioned, data libraries and also the parameters. It's unbelievable how many people throw away their parameters and then can't replicate their own products. It's really weird. And then, so I've just slightly shifted this over to the kinds of things that given it's easily transparent, we should be able to look up. And then also, besides all those parts of the systems engineering, you should have already determined what tests you needed to pass and be able to show what those tests were and how the passing happened during, and then after release, if you have, you should have things that are making sure things are still performing well, whether or not you have machine learning. And if you think all this stuff is impossible, remember that every single time the driverless car has been in an accident, we've had like front page news about what went wrong within like 2 days, right? Why? Because the automotive industry is reasonably well regulated. Okay, so you can have people claiming, oh, it's impossible, AI is opaque, we just have to accept that so we get better performance on the main stage of like an O'Reilly event. This happened to me in New York City, right? Giant, stadium. You go downstairs where all the people that are teaching, their courses to people, and there's all these people providing the exact tools the guys upstairs are saying are impossible. They're providing them to the automotive industry, the medical industry, the insurance industry, because those industries have to have those tools. You can do it. All right. If you're good with digital technology, transparency should be easy. And here's another thing that Lynette stole. Same example, but it's not surprising that 2 people talk about this. In fact, I think it was talked about yesterday. This is me with 2 of those 4 people. Last time I was in Seattle. But of course, that's not the only Google failure of transparency that I worry about personally. I was also on this, I won't say the rude word for what that was, or there's multiple rude words. Okay, anyway, it's called the Advanced Technology, ATEC, Advanced Technology External Advisory Council. That's right, there we go. And it was also shut down partly by internal conflict about who they didn't see that they wanted this much diversity on their external advisory council. Okay, so then let's get back to those actual limits of transparency I talked to you about. The first one is physical. People keep forgetting that there's physical things that are problems, right? I mentioned before that intelligence is computation. It's not an abstraction. It's not perfect. It's not eternal, and it's not instantaneous. It takes time, space, and energy. Finding the right thing to do at the right time. One way you could think about it is search. You think, oh no, I learn, I don't search. Well, learning is a search for parameters. Okay, so you trust me, you search. And the cost of search is like the number of things that you could do raised to how many things you're going to do, how many steps you get to take. And I know that's a little abstract. So here's an example. If you had a robot that had 100 things it could do, and it needed to get to Paris or something, then if it happens that one of the things that it's been programmed to do is get to Paris and it doesn't know that, then in the worst case, there's 100 things that would have to try to get to Paris. If it happens that it has to turn left, then go to Paris, there's already 10,000 possible plans, 100 things you could try, followed by another 100 things. And we all know that we do a lot more than 2 things in a day. So this is amazingly, the combinatorial explosion is impossible to get your head around. One of the great ways, and you're not going to believe this, but it's okay, the same guy who figured out information theory, he figured out this. The number of 35 move games of chess, so not moving the rook back and forth forever, is greater than the numbers of atoms in the universe, okay? And we all know by now that chess is simpler than Go, and Go is simpler than life, okay? So we are never going to have omniscience. That's not a real threat. That particular version of the singularity is not sensible. Super intelligence we already have, but not omniscience. That's not a problem. So how is it that humans are even as smart as we are? Because one thing you can do is you have 2 computers that then you can spend half the time, but the same amount of energy, and you need twice as much space, right? Quantum saves space some of the time. So you can run concurrently in the same computer, multiple things, but it seems to be worse than the same amount of energy so far. I'm not, just random quantum expert, but I've been giving this slide for a while and no one has well, actually you'll get one person contradict anything. But anyway, all the informed people are going, yeah. It looks right now like if quantum is ever brought on board, unless we achieve true energy independence, which again, some transhumanists believe is around the corner, is only going to be used by like nation states and in weaponized contexts. It's too expensive to use for anything seriously otherwise. Okay, so human intelligence, including AI, which I would say is a part of our society's intelligence, is based on millennia of concurrent parallel search. That's how we handle this change, and this is part of that globalization process people were talking about. We have approximately 8 billion people coming more and more online, right? Getting better nutrition, better educations, and better connection to each other through ICT. And that, I would say, is much more of the change in the pace of change than just AI itself. I think mobile phones are a lot bigger part of that. So one of the consequences of this, the consequence that AI, when we train it with machine learning based on what we already know, is that we get the same implicit biases. I would rather call them stereotypes that come out of the data. And so this is a paper in 2017. I'm not going to go into details. Again, it's pretty well known at this stage. It was in Science, but the basic thing is that the same implicit biases that psychologists had been demonstrating using reaction times about what was easier to pair, which concepts were easier to pair. If you just look at the word embeddings, which are basically giant spreadsheets where you just count like how similar of a context do these words occur in, you get the same result. And it turned out that, again, speaking of cancel culture, I had no idea. The results of the implicit bias that the psychologists had done were some of the biggest effects. You see that D, it means that it was more than one standard deviation away, right? How much easier it was to pair female names with family words and male names with career words than the other way around. More than one standard deviation. Okay, so absolutely not a controversial result. Oh, but it was, because people didn't like the result and because it didn't correlate with our explicit biases, which that's the difference between implicit and explicit. Okay, we get this paper done. Arvind Narayanan, maybe it's just because he's a genius of fairness and transparent AI. He's been going to the conference for years. I still haven't attended yet. But also he was up for tenure that year. He was kind of freaked out about how strong this was. So he had the absolute genius idea of now that we've got the word embeddings, we've captured implicit bias in our AI, let's see how it relates to the real world. Okay, so this is one of two measures we took. It's the US labor statistics. And so the y-axis there is those evil, sexist, showing implicit bias word embeddings. And the x-axis and the dots are the names of jobs. And the x-axis is the actual, according to US labor statistics, the proportion of people in those jobs that are women, okay? And so again, 90% row is really a big number. You don't get that in psychology. And you're saying, well, what is that noise? What's that one orange dot? Some of the noise is because, first of all, this was scraping the entire English language web, and these are US labor statistics, but some of it was because some of these jobs had two words, like they were double barreled, like domestic engineer or something. We would just call that engineer. We dropped the adjective. So that's where some of the noise is coming from. Unfortunately, this word embedding stuff only works on single. Well, because of combinatorics, you could do it with two, but you'd need, you need a bigger computer. All right, so what does this all tell us? It tells us that human stereotypes are actually bootstrapping off of our lived experience. And this was something that actually the Stochastic Parrots, it didn't cite this paper, but it did cite this fact. That you will get the reflection of our present lived reality when you go off of present data. It's not surprising. So our implicit behavior is not our ideal, right? And that's not that surprising. Ideals are for explicit communication. You can look at the part of the brain that we generate language out of, and that we generate our plans out of, and that is associated with consciousness. And like I said, it's all the same. So we talk about we use explicit plans to form ideas of better societies. And that's what we're going to. And our implicit is just trailing behind us. And so this is so in our paper, we give one of these examples because Eileen, the first author, she's Turkish. And so Turkish is also one of these languages where there isn't a he or a she, there's just one pronoun. But this Finnish one is just beautiful. So I used it instead of Eileen's. So you can see this, the same pronoun is being used in the Finnish, but depending on the context, which is the more common word is going to come up. That's how machine learning is going to do that, right? So you have the system and you decide this is not, you've built a translator, you decide this is not acceptable. It reflects reality, but we no longer express that reality, we're trying to change our reality. How do you deal with that? And I feel very strongly that in order to make sure that we can maintain accountability and transparency, we need to have simple, straightforward algorithms here so that they should, in fact, wind up reflecting the lived experience, which is going to be stereotyped, unfair output. And then have a separate system. You choose what you think is the fair output that you want to see and build a separate system, which is, again, maybe it's actually explainable AI that's human readable. That would be great. This is what actually happens. You know, again, you think, oh, she's once conscious AI, but no. This is exactly what happens with text prediction, right? There's a list of words that you won't predict. So your text prediction never says bad words, right? So it's not that hard to do necessarily. And then the whole thing is the translator. If you do find it a little harder to handle all the isms, and of course I shouldn't diminish that. Another thing you could do is have a machine learning thing that you put in there, but put it in separately. If we let people just make one single system, then it really is opaque. And then Google goes around to EU Commission meetings and says, oh, by the way, AI is necessarily opaque. And so then you can't see whether while they were debiasing it from gender, they were also increasing the bias towards going to the places where they get more money, right? So it's important that each stage should be auditable and replicable. We should be able to check and say, do you have worse bias than we would expect? Does the stuff with recidivism, was that just a mistake? Or was it that somebody had actually somebody had injected into it that was racist, or that they just wanted to have Republicans get elected more or whatever, decided that was why they should have these bad recidivism results, okay? So you need to make sure that each stage demonstrably meets criteria that have been specified clearly in advance. All right. Let's talk about polarization. How am I doing for time? I actually can't, I have two devices in front of me and I can't see the clock on either. Hello, who's the host? Okay, I'll get up my phone. Oh wait, I think I do, no? Okay. Are you guys still there?
Yeah, we are here. We hear you.
Okay,
Yes.
what time, how much time do I have left?
You have 15 minutes left.
1-5. Okay, good. All right, so polarization. I'm just trying to decide how much detail to go into this. This is now a totally different reason why we have problems with transparency. And I'm starting out with an example of not transparency, but rather just bad things, okay? So income inequality is going from low to high on the x-axis here, and on the y-axis, health and social problems is going from better at low and worse high, which is not the way you usually draw it. But then you see, and this is 2011 data, I'm not guaranteeing everybody's in the same place right now, but at that point, America was there, it's probably further now. Germany was here, clustered with the rest of the EU. And then, yeah, these weird Anglo people over here, sort of in between. It's better than America. Anyway, so inequality, we knew it was a problem, right? But we didn't know exactly why it was a problem. But one thing we knew is that it's really highly correlated with political polarization. So this is American data. I apologize for being American-centric here. A lot of this stuff is, but the results, we're working on it now, testing in more places, and it has been tested by some other people anyway. The point is that the dark gray line here is the proportion of income that goes to the top 1%. And the reason that starts in 1913 is because that was when America was abandoning alcohol tax and replaced it with income tax. So we suddenly have records of that. The political polarization, we look at whether there's only two parties, it's a primitive democracy, and whether they cooperated in Congress. And so we could see actually, and we have records, like more qualitative records of this, that inequality was increasing massively through the 19th century. And people were saying, you know, people like Churchill were coming home and saying, why is it getting harder and harder to coming home from wars, of course, colonial wars, and then saying, wait, why is it so much harder to govern now than it was 10 years ago? So that was what was happening in the 19th century. And then that problem peaked around the time of World War I. And immediately before and after World War I, it was like some kind of destabilizing thing happened. And then there's the financial crash. And after the financial crash and World War I, enough of the elite said, okay, this is too much entropy. We're losing big too. We aren't dying in the wars necessarily, but we're losing all our stuff, our wealth, our capital, and there's just too much entropy. So they signed up, enough, not all, but enough signed up with the proletariat that you got FDR. You got the New Deal. And so you had a reduction in polarization first, and then the capacity to reduce the inequality, which of course massively happened during the war. Again, that's a huge source of redistribution as well as destruction of capital. But then it was kept very low until about 1978. And that's also the time when wages stopped being aligned with productivity. And my personal guess about what happened, that was also when, well, actually the early 70s are when the Soviet economy plateaued. Before that, it had been starting up from feudalism and rocketing up. And I think people thought that the reason it was hard to govern was because Marx and his dangerous idea. And then the Soviet Union was an embodiment of that. And then when it hit the ceiling of how good they were able to essentially plan an economy, everyone said, oh, this is over. Okay, and yes, it took a few more years for the wall to come down and things, but in the 70s, that was when basically the economists and the elite apparently noticed. Anyway, that's my personal theory that hasn't been demonstrated, but some of the other stuff I'm about to show you has. I already just talked about this. Oh, so what causes the inequality? I think now it's because when you introduce a new distance reducing technology, or a technology that reduces the cost of distance, then of course you have fewer winners. And this is what we're totally seeing with these ICT companies that can flog their stuff around the world. But we've also seen it, you know, the companies that those displaced in the last 10 years or so, in terms of the largest companies, they were petrochemical, also aerospace. You can fly an airplane anywhere. If it weren't for the EU building Airbus, there would only be Boeing, right? So these are the kinds of things I think are actually driving it, but as it says, perhaps that's still hypothetical. And then I hate it when people talk about the great decoupling. What happened in 1978? Was it AI? Was it the collapse of the unions? I want to talk about the great coupling. That looks super artificial. I'm sorry I didn't include this, especially if you look at the longer wave of history. I would say that was policy. Someone decided we needed to do something. We needed to do redistribution. And also with Bretton Woods, that we decided that you couldn't just extract wealth from countries the way we had actually in the incredibly unjust settlement of World War I. Terrible thing, sorry about that. So anyway, as I mentioned, it required the elite to realize that it's in their own interest to stabilize things while they're still elite. Okay, it shouldn't be that hard to explain it. And notice that this is not about complete, idealized Marxism or something. Although there's that whole thing about lobster salads. But anyway, empirically, and there's no theory behind this, but empirically, the ideal Gini coefficient is actually about 0.27. That's on a range from 0 to 1. Okay, but so it does seem that it helps to both be motivated and to reward innovation or possibly merit. I don't know. Okay, so why is it that inequality and polarization are correlated? We came up with a model that may explain it. That there's a causal step, but it's not really inequality itself that's doing the work. So we started from the assumption, which again, empirically, we knew that outgroup diversity has higher expected outcomes. So there's a bunch of people that have shown that when you work with more diverse groups, as long as it's not token diversity, if you stick one woman on an all male panel or one man on an all female panel, it tends to be worse, not better. But even that's just it. As soon as you get to like 2 members of a board, you're already better. And then the optimal is for outcomes. This is like mostly done on corporate boards or whatever. The optimal is 50-50. So it's sort of a Mexican hat function. Anyway, we took that from the empirical. And so the thing we added in, which I don't think is too much of a great assumption, is that in-group cooperation has lower risk. That is, you can predict the outcomes. So you have a higher expected outcome with diversity, but with lower diversity, you know what the outcome is going to be. There's not going to be a failure, a collapse of cooperation. And so the outcome of our model, when we made those assumptions, was that when an economy is no longer offering adequate support, then avoiding the risk of a big collapse. Okay, so that's one really important piece here. So you have to be worried about something like bankruptcy or death, something that you can't recover from or can't easily recover from. Then it can become, in some contexts, more important to avoid risk than to maximize revenue. All right, so that there are contexts. So here's the picture. So if you look, this is very abstracted. The far right is the strong economy, and the far left is a very weak economy. And so we set it up from the beginning. We set the parameters such that, oh, I didn't tell you, the y-axis is how risky is that outgroup the interaction. So how probable is it that the outgroup interaction is going to succeed? All right. So 1 at the top is they always succeed. And of course, if it's always going to succeed and it's a higher payout, we should always do that. And then we set up the simulation so that if half of your interactions collapse, that's the point where you're better off working with the in-group. Okay, so in the best of all possible worlds with a good economy. Now, as the economy declines towards 0 there, you see that there becomes a greater and greater zone for where it's better to avoid that risk. So that's that bump there in the middle we're calling polarization. Now you might be saying, but what about that other bump? It turns out that if you know what your payoff is with your in-group, and it's not enough to survive, it's not enough to avoid those really catastrophic outcomes, then you're better off doing gambling for resurrection, it's called. And that was good because that also matches the data. So yeah, so as I mentioned, causes of the discontinuity there are things like fear of bankruptcy, foreclosure, divorce, losing children, starvation, things like that. All right, so, I thought I'd move the slide. Oh, well, put it here. There's one thing that's really important about our model. You would look at that, you would say, oh, so all we have to do is go back towards supporting the economy. All we have to do is support the economy or provide adequate social welfare. And this sort of explains why Germany and China both had very high inequality, but they didn't have as high polarization as some other places with equally unequal societies, because they had been doing a lot of work to make sure that the bottom was well supported and was much better off than they had been before. All right, so this is like if in our model, all you have to do when you see that the world is better is you just decide, hey, I think I'm going to cooperate with those other guys. Then you see that the purple line there is how good the economy is. It relates to the right y-axis, sorry about that. And the left y-axis, my partner is a data scientist. He hates when I do this all the time, dual y axes. The left y-axis is what the black line there is, which is like, are you polarized or not? So you're starting out working with in diversity with the outgroup, and then when the economy gets weak, you get highly polarized, but then all of a sudden it gets so weak that doesn't work, and so you go back to being not all polarized, and then as it recovers, you reverse it. Okay, that's not what seems to happen in real life, and so Alex Stewart, the guy who's the first author on this and did all the modeling work, and is a genius, he made a slightly different assumption, which is that you don't get to just choose, like say I'm cooperating with you, both have to agree at the same time. And that gives a little bit more stickiness, which is much more like what the political scientist and the final author, no, I think he's the middle author, Nolan McCarty, was the political scientist, all the data and experience on this substance issue. They've noticed that you don't tend to get back out of polarization, which is completely correlated with identity politics, unless something big happens, like war, pandemic. So we're working really hard now to address this now, and so is the Biden administration. Anyway, so hypothetically, being at risk of catastrophic loss, starvation, bankruptcy, as I mentioned, leads to risk aversion and therefore identity politics. And then identity politics leads to concepts being used as flags more than operators for reasoning. And so also, we know empirically, this is not hypothetically, inequality reduces social mobility. And I think that also is another reason that we're having problems with fake news or whatever. Without social mobility, you have fewer people that someone knows they can trust, they can explain to them. They can't just call up and say, the friend that's a doctor. I've had friends who are doctors since I was a little kid because it used to be high social mobility in the 70s. I wasn't from a professional background, but you would know someone who knew someone who was a doctor. And that isn't happening in America anymore. Now, of course, Europe is much more socially mobile than America. And yeah, again, this goes back to the whole combinatorics and concurrency thing. We want to have people, we want to have a better mixed society so that people can have an idea of who they can trust and where they can get information. Okay, finally, and this is the thing that Lynette was brought up nicely, this thing about multiple conflicting goals. I thought, oh, this is a totally new take, and then Lynette just did it. But anyway, why can't the world's leading communication company communicate even internally? Well, presumably they can, up to the limits of time, space, and energy. But it seems that the different actors have different priorities, right? So some of them really care about maintaining their first mover advantage. It's weird, these companies are so successful, and yet right now they're so terrified. They really seem like, not all of them, actually, a lot of Facebookers are like, oh yeah, whatever, we know we have plenty. But anyway, it seems like they're getting really terrified and they believe in this whole thing that there's no way to succeed, and that there's going to be, if they were in a better regulated situation, they wouldn't have to worry. It's like an autocrat, like a president doesn't get killed when they get out of power, an autocrat does. Well, a non-autocratic president. Anyway, so if you have this and the other actors hired to ensure ethical integrity, then the apparent breakdown of transparency might actually be some kind of logical impasse where they literally can't understand each other because they cannot come to the root of their semantics, which is their motivational structure. So yeah, I mean, sometimes we forget about this, at least computer scientists. Maybe you guys are lawyers and it's really obvious, but computer scientists forget that there's times when you just can't explain things to somebody. This is incidentally an amazing video of the Georgians trying to get us back to their airport. Anyway, I'm going to skip over GPEG because I think I ran too long, but you can ask me about that in Q&A. I want to talk more about what could be done. So with respect to combinatorics, cooperate, build computers, but ultimately it's intractable, but we can do better and better. It's just one of those things that we can improve on. Polarization, we need to work hard. This comes back to the governance question. We need to reduce vulnerability through adequate infrastructure. Yeah, let's Q&A. Multiple conflicting goals. This was literally my PhD. So what I recommended then was iterative design that we keep trying to improve, again, relating to Lynette's second sort of understanding of fairness. And this is what governance and politics are all about. The social scientists have been working on this for millennia, and it's amazing. Okay, I'll tell a brief GP. I was on a thing with, it was a public debate, so I don't think this is a problem, but with the head of the responsible AI group within a working group within GPay, Yashua Bengio. And it was like, even though he brought a whole bunch of, there's like 5 other people there to the panel, the first one said stuff that he'd been thinking about. It's a complete genius of machine learning and seeing how gradients work. It's like, oh, economics has an answer for that. And then he was like gonna not let the rest of us, who were all female, talk. And so we all like ganged up and just intervened and said, wait, listen to the rest of us too. And there was like a biologist and political scientist, and we have been working on this. This is what these groups have been working on for centuries. I don't need to speak this to a law office, but anyway, that is a problem that technologists do not always realize, that there's a ton of solutions people have been working on. Yeah, breathing, it's a form of regulation. And I don't just mean that in the, like, let's become, although it was time to say that, but also it is a part of the process of regulation. Yeah, remember how I defined regulation back at the beginning, that it's part of the process of perpetuation of a society or an organism. Breathing is an oscillation. You're not going to ever have the right amount of oxygen, or like if you're very, very small, then you don't need to have like this breathing thing and the pumps and all that. But basically, it turns out that dealing with diverse solutions, having swings and roundabouts, is a good way to regulate. It isn't about that suddenly we're going to get to a perfect just society, or we were in one and someone knocked us out of it. It's not like that. It is about like trying to converge to something. And again, ultimately intractable. The universe is going to either have another burst or heat death. We don't know which. but we've been succeeding as a lineage for billions of years. So I think we shouldn't let that freak us out too much. So again, this is me speculating. The information age should mean that I shouldn't say should mean, I think it does mean that we now have to handle basic truths that we hadn't been paying attention to before, including justice for more types of people than people had been aware they knew about, at least not sufficiently explicitly thinking about. It means everyone is more empowered than ever before in some ways, right? And I think we should be working on things like communicating everything. So for transparency, sorry, I should have been clear about this on these slides. That what we should be working on when we work about transparency is figuring out those levels of abstraction that are really useful to large audiences, right? So setting that up and putting it out there, and then providing within those the drill down points to the extra levels of detail that you need. Like, so if you want to know more, you're like, I'm not happy with that, explain it to me harder. Then when you go less abstracted, it is going to be less accessible too. That's just definitionally true. So document those barriers to overcome in order to drill down. And some of these, again, going back to GPay, are going to be things like security clearances, right? There are some things that just are works in progress, or they have to do with national security or whatever. So it may be that to drill down, you would have to just change your entire career. You might have to go get a whole new language or new capacities that might take a few years rather than your entire career. Some things may not be accessible to everyone. But I think we need to have a strong social fabric so that we can still find people we can trust that have access to that. And that's another form of access, that calling someone who can call someone that can explain to you. Dan Dennett gives this story about being in a bar with a biologist, a famous biologist, and someone of his friends calls up and says, "Is a fish a bird?" Okay, and he thinks that this is like an example of how people, what could that even have meant? But I take that as an example of somebody who really didn't know much about biology that could call up a famous biologist while he's in a bar and hang out with a famous philosopher, right? That's the kind of society that we need more of to help with these kinds of barriers, okay? So I think if we could conquer polarization, conquer inequality, I don't know if conquer is the right word, again, it's regulatory, but those are the things that will help make some of these barriers more acceptable, that people will say, okay, I get that I need a PhD, I don't want to do that, or I do want to do that, and whatever. That'll just it might reduce some of the anger around all this. So this is one of my old slides. I've been saying this for a long time. The main thing I recommend to the European Commission and the Union is that we legislate and adjudicate for accountability, and we provide enough resources for enforcement. Then I think transparency will follow, because then the corporations are motivated to be able to prove due diligence. So I think that's the main thing we need there. And I thank you for your attention.